Greetings and welcome. This is Senior English B, and our objectives are to speak now about James Joyce and more particularly his classic short story, Araby. I want to start actually with some biographic information. 1922, this is an important date. 1922, that many argue in the 20th century was probably the single most important year for literature. In the same year, T.S. Eliot will publish his most famous poem, The Wasteland. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain, the opening lines of that poem. You'll maybe recall that I only had you just listen to that poem some. We didn't really study that one. Remember, I said that the Hollow Men is kind of cliff notes for The Wasteland. The other poem, or the other thing published, is not a poem, it's a novel. It's called Ulysses. The Latin name you'll remember for what great figure in literature? Odysseus, right? Ulysses. Now, this novel didn't have anything specifically to do with Greek mythology and Odysseus. This was a novel written by the Irish writer James Joyce. Let me say a couple of things about James Joyce. At the end of the 20th century, Random House, which is Mr. Harder, this publishing company, decided they'd play a game and they'd make a list of the 100 greatest novels of the 20th century. Millions of novels written in the 20th century, right? These people were going to get together and make a list. By the way, if you want, you can Google this list to see. Some of my students have said, wow, that would be an interesting 100 books to read. Some group of people thought that what were the greatest 100 novels of the 20th century. And obviously there was huge debate as there was buzz about this list being made, about what novel would be number one. What would be considered the most important novel of the 20th century? What novel would be number one? Let me say it to you this way. There were a lot of writers who didn't get on that list of the 100 greatest novels of the 20th century. To get on there once was considered a monumental affair. James Joyce is on there 3 times. 2 of his novels in the top 5. He has number 1, Ulysses, and then at number 5, his Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. 2 of his novels are in the top 5 of the 100 greatest novels, and the other one, Finnegan's Wake, also ends up on that list as well. Well, that stat alone should tell you that there's something really important about this guy named James Joyce. Who is this guy and why should we care? And how are we going to read this short story, Araby, which for all accounts is a pretty boring story. Let's just say what it is. It's a boring story. There's not much that happens in the story. What's going on? Well, I think I've already mentioned to you that there's 3 really influential thinkers that influenced the thought of the 20th century. I'll review this again with you for your notes. The first of these is Darwin, who said in a classic treatise right before the beginning of the 20th century, he said, look, all of life, biological life, is about an intense struggle, constant competition for survival. The second influential thinker was a guy named Karl Marx. And Marx came along and said, hey, you know what? Darwin is right. All of life is about a biological struggle, but it's far more important than that to recognize the economic struggle between humans and cultures. Economics explains everything, and that's why we have to study it so closely. All about struggle, not just biological, but cultural economic struggle. The third thinker was Freud. And this holy trinity of thinkers that really influenced 20th century, not always in positive ways, we might point out. The third thinker is Freud. And Freud says, you know what? Darwin's right. Biology is a struggle. And you know what? Marx is right as well. There is a struggle in terms of economics. But there's a third, even more influential struggle, and it's the struggle of the psyche or the mind. If you were to crawl inside of your mind right now, and you were able to pay attention to your thoughts, and they were written for you the way ESPN puts words at the bottom of its screen to tell you scores, Freud said 2 things. 1, that strand of stuff that's called your thoughts wouldn't be a single strand. There would be multiple ones that would be happening concurrently. And about those strands, he said, number 2, most of it you're unaware of. The unconscious, what later will be called the subconscious. Freud himself never used that term. Sub meaning below the conscious. In other words, there's a whole lot of stuff that's going on in the human psyche you are completely unaware of until you start thinking and analyzing your dreams. In 1901, Freud will publish Interpretation of Dreams, his most important text, where he suggests, if you really want to know what you're thinking about, study your dreams. And there's a whole lot going on there that you are not aware of in your waking moments. About those dreams, Freud said, 2 things are constantly ever present for all humans in the mind. 1, considerations of sex. Now, this isn't just about sex as pleasure. This is back to Darwin, sex as the continuation of the species. That is to say, the survival of the species requires that we have increasingly numbers of the species. That requires copulation, that is to say, sex. So constantly thinking about sex. But the second one is anxiety, fear, and its manifestations, especially in the form of aggression, anger, rage, wanting to kind of punch something, or wanting to do destruction in some way, either to oneself or to other people. And because I'm aware I feel that way, I'm always afraid of other people because they may be wanting to jack me as well. And so there's this constant distrust that I always have of other people. And so there's this constant agitation, which is why Freud said, we're always biting on ourselves. That's the whole point of that. He said, just take a look at people, watch people, sit in an airport or whatever, and identify the ways that we're always doing this, right? Harder puts his hand down, of course, screws Nicholas, right? And Freud says, the minute you start doing this, it'll freak you out. Because the minute that you start asking, why am I always... I have a lot of fear. I have a lot of anxiety. Of course, seniors in high school, some 12 days away from their first semester being ended, can report, yeah, I understand this thing about fear and anxiety. It's like ever present. I'm always worrying. I don't sleep very well. Freud said, hey, that's not called being a senior. That's called being human. And it's ongoing. If you think you're busy now, just wait 10 years. If you think your life is complicated now, just wait 15 years. Your life's going to get a whole lot more complicated. And by the way you know that is to just remember how simple life was when you were in 6th grade. That was 6 years ago. That was 6 years ago. 6 years from now, your life's going to be a whole lot more complicated than it is now, regardless of what you think. And that's not only in regards to your job, that's Marx and economics. That's not only in regards to the survival of the species, but it's also in regards to the mind. Joyce, along with a number of other writers, takes the philosophy and ideas of Freud pretty seriously. And he asks a really intriguing question. What if I were to tell stories from the perspective of the mind or the psyche? What if I could crawl inside of a character's mind and just represent his or her thoughts? I wouldn't care so much about what the individual was doing on the outside. For example, the individual might just be sitting on the subway. If you looked at the individual would almost look like in zombie state, doing absolutely nothing. But Freud says, oh, you've totally missed it. Just because that individual's sitting on a subway in zombie state doing absolutely nothing does not mean that individual is not doing something. If you could go inside that individual's mind could be working at monumental light speed. Anxiety could be intense, even though the body looks like it's doing nothing. Joyce, along with a number of other writers, decided to play a game. It was called the game of, for your notes at 2B, stream of consciousness. Stream of consciousness. Now, Freud was the one who said that the human psyche or the human mind is like a river or a stream. If you go out to the Bighorn River, for example, there's parts of that river that are moving, correct? Flowing. There's other parts of that river off to the side in the banks that are somewhat more still. And then if you moved underneath the banks of that river, we know this, right? There's all kinds of stuff living there and then all the way down to the bottom, and then there's that heavy mud at the bottom. There's stuff even under the mud. That's a river. Freud said that's what the human mind is like. Most of the important stuff, he said, is buried deep, deep down in the river. And to that degree, if you're talking about the stream of consciousness, you would want to, as a writer, try to represent what's going on in the mind. Are you ready for this? Joyce writes an 800-page novel about one day in the life of one man. And all he does is report what the cat's thinking. He calls the novel Ulysses, and he publishes it in 1922. Instead of Odysseus taking his series of journeys, remember when he has to get back to Ithaca, he takes all those journeys? Joyce will picture one guy walking through the streets of Dublin. But he doesn't, other than to say, very briefly in one line, he walks into the butcher's shop to pick up some meat. That's all he says. But then he goes on at length telling us what he's actually thinking as he's standing there about to get his meat when a young girl comes walking in, college-age girl comes walking in, and he looks at her. Now remember what Freud said. Thoughts are constantly about sex. And so, yeah, a whole lot of what Joyce is going to write about has to do with sex. In 1922, when the book is published, it is banned. And I'm not making this up. If you try to bring that novel into the United States in 1922, you are put in jail. It is against U.S. law to bring the novel Ulysses into this United States. Why? Because it's considered pornographic or obscene. Why? Because Joyce is very experimental in the ways in which he plays games. Are you ready for this? He has a chapter where there is no punctuation. He goes on for 50 pages with one sentence. But if you'll think about it, that makes sense. Because while I'm speaking right now, you're thinking. Freud said 98% of what you're thinking about, you're unaware of. You're unaware of. You're thinking about all kinds of stuff, but you don't even know what you're thinking about. What if we wanted to try to report what that stuff is? I'm sorry, it isn't in full sentences. The mind doesn't use periods, doesn't use exclamation marks, doesn't use question marks. If you really wanted to represent what the mind was thinking, you wouldn't use punctuation. You would just write words. Joyce had a really intriguing question as well. How do you represent body sounds? So, for example, a long, loud fart. If you don't want to say the character farted out loud and was embarrassed, but rather you just want to pronounce the fart, how would you do that? He spent days coming up with the way to represent on the page the sound. Yeah, no kidding. See, this is the kind of writer that he is. He's very experimental. By the way, let's make the quick list of the really important writers who are changing the world of fiction, the landscape of fiction in the 20th century. Joyce is one who experiments with stream of consciousness. Another is a woman named Virginia Woolf. She's a very influential British writer. In America, his name is Faulkner. Okay, William Faulkner, who will write really important novels. By the way, several of them ended up on that Random House list as well. All of those are as well very experimental. For example, Faulkner wrote a novel called The Sound and Fury, where for the first 100 pages, called the Benji section, Benji short for Benjamin, Benjamin is a mentally challenged individual in his 30s who has the mind of a 3-year-old. Faulkner wrote the entire 100 pages stream of consciousness from the perspective of Benji. He doesn't write in full sentences because an individual with the mind of a 3 or 4-year-old wouldn't think as an adult would think. And so he throws one more curveball. It is painful to read. It's just like one of my students once said, reading the first 100 pages of the Benji section can drive you totally nuts, which is kind of the point. That is to say, experimental. Now let's get to Araby. This is a short story where nothing is going on physically. Do you notice this? Nothing is happening physically. The young boy waits around, notice, for adults who never show up on time. Do you notice this? They have no capacity to understand the life of a child. And then finally, when the kid arrives at the market to buy something, he doesn't have what? No, he doesn't have enough money to buy anything. Ultimately, how does the story end? Now, James Joyce will invent an important phrase for your notes. The phrase is, he didn't invent it, but he made it very popular. Epiphany. You've maybe heard this word. I'm having an epiphany. What is an epiphany? An epiphany is a realization, right? An aha moment. When after the aha moment or the epiphany, you are fundamentally changed. It's like you go, ah, and there's no going back after that. The epiphany kind of changes you and the way you think. It is a grand realization. Oh, that's called an epiphany. Now for Joyce, all of his texts involve these kinds of levels of epiphanies. He's always interested in young people, especially younger characters, and the epiphanies that we have. Now Freud had said that for young people, it is one disclosure after another, one revelation after another. Think about it this way. What do you know now that you did not know when you were a freshman? You thought you knew everything 4 years ago, right? You were cocksure you knew everything. You figured out you understood everything. As a senior, you kind of have a tendency to look back and go, yeah, one or two things I probably didn't understand. Right? But now I do know. Of course, we realize that probably in 4 years you'll look back with the same observation. Oh yeah, high school was kind of a series of epiphanies, not all of them good, right? Where you kind of go, oh, now I get. And see, once you got it, right? It's not like you can undo it. It's not like you can go, okay, I'm going to pretend like I don't know that anymore. That's not the way the human mind works. Once you know, you know. At the end of our story, we have an epiphany. What is the epiphany at the end of the story? Notice what the boy says as he walks away, gazing up into the darkness. I saw myself as a creature, driven and derided by vanity. The word here meaning uselessness, meaninglessness. And my eyes burned with anguish and anger. Now, if we had time, we could, of course, go into the Freudian reading of this line. Obviously, there's a whole lot of Freud here, right? It's pretty easy to say, on the one hand, right, if we were to speak in the most, lowest and plebeian of languages, Mr. Lane pointed out, yeah, he's mad because he obviously ain't getting nothing tonight. That's our Freudian understanding of the sexual understanding of this, right? That's an easy interpretation of this text. But wait a minute, the title is called Araby. Why would Joyce call a story about a young boy who is frustrated, wanting the girl, wanting to please the girl, can't do it? Why would he call the story Araby? And what point is being made about life and the life of this young boy? It's all right there in the final line as well. Say it out loud.
Meaningless?
Meaningless. Really? What is your life? Well, let's just analyze it since you are a freshman. One day after the next, after the next, after the next.
Don't forget the next one.
And the next one. Or we assume.
And the day after that.
And the day after that. But wait a minute. How can you go through a series of these day after day after day where nothing happens? What do you mean? Lots of things happen in my life. Really? Really? Let's analyze it at all with any kind of objectivity, and let's just accept the fact you spent most of high school looking for the next day to come. And then the next day. You're still doing it. And then the next day. To do what? Like what really? You're going to graduate on a Sunday. What really will Monday be that's different? Oh. Right? It's that right. It's that moment of that becomes the epiphany of this story. What would it mean to lift the veil and to realize, that's all life? What? That's it? After all of the hope and expectation, this in some ways becomes the point of the title of our story, Araby. The expectations that ultimately, well, how many freshmen, sophomores, so excited, think about prom for the first time. Yay! See, you laugh now because you're seniors. It can never, ever match what is the expectation in the mind, correct? It's going to be so exciting. Which leads one to ask, why ever be excited about anything? Looking forward to anything? Well, this will be, of course, at the heart of the story as well. This ain't about not being able to get something for his girl. This is about realizing, oh, this may be my life. Moment after moment after moment of having an expectation and then going, it never works out the way I thought it would. How does one reconcile the fact that one has to live this kind of life? That is a fundamental Joycean question. Notice how he's playing the game of we are the hollow men, we are the stuffed men of T.S. Eliot. But now he's playing it a little different. He doesn't write a poem, he just writes a short story about a boy where nothing happens. For those of you who say, this is a really boring story because nothing happens, Joyce says back to you, what? Like, your life isn't this? No, my life isn't this. My life is exciting. Really? Jeez, that's kind of a downer. Remember Eliot's, this is the way the world ends, not with a bang, a whimper. Geez, that's not a very uplifting way to end a Thursday morning lecture. Sorry, welcome to James Joyce.